In 1857, the cotton fields of Wilkinson County, Mississippi, stretched without end beneath a brutal sun. The heavy air hung thick with humidity and something more, a stifling quiet that seemed to weigh down on everything in its path. It was at the Magnolia Ridge plantation that a deal was struck, one that would ripple across the years like a stone cast into calm water, sending out waves of dread that would never fully fade. 3 stories tall stood the plantation house, its white columns stained yellow by long neglect. Ancient oaks were draped in Spanish moss like funeral veils, and the wooden floors groaned with secrets, absorbed by the walls across generations. In this place, whispers traveled farther than screams, and the living found themselves envying the dead. One Tuesday morning in late September, as the leaves began their slow dying, Overseer Thomas Blackwood received word that a slave girl was to be sold. Such transactions were hardly unusual. They came as reliably as the dawn. But this particular sale carried an urgent edge that made even the most seasoned plantation workers exchange uneasy glances. In the plantation ledger, the girl's name was written as Patience. Records put her at 18, though her true age remained as uncertain as most everything else in her short life. What was clear was that she had been marked as ill, unfit for the heavy labor that justified her upkeep. The overseer's careful handwriting noted simply, consumption suspected, frequent coughing spells, loss of weight observed. Yet other notations, in different handwriting, hinted at a different tale. Small marks in the margins of the ledger, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Symbols suggesting something far more troubling than illness had doomed this young woman to be cast off. The owner of the plantation, Colonel Jeremiah Witmore, had taken over Magnolia Ridge from his father 20 years before. At 45, he had graying temples and hands untouched by honest labor. His wife, Elanina, passed her days in the parlor embroidering pillow covers, pretending not to hear the sounds that rose from the quarters after dark. The Witmores had 3 children, Margaret, 22, already showing signs of the nervous disposition that plagued the family line, James, 19, drunk more often than sober, and little Catherine, just 16, still innocent enough to ask questions that made adults exchange meaningful glances. On the morning of the sale, Patience was brought to the front courtyard of the main house. Those who saw her arrive would later struggle to describe exactly what they witnessed. Some said she looked normal, perhaps a bit thin, but nothing that would explain the rush to sell her. Others claimed something was wrong with her eyes. Not their color or shape, but the way she looked at things, as if she could peer straight through the surface of the world into whatever lay beneath. Just before noon, the buyer arrived. His name was Silas Crane, a trader known across the region for buying slaves others considered damaged goods. He specialized in what he called reclamation projects. Individuals bought cheaply and either restored to usefulness or, failing that, put to work in ways that required no particular care for their well-being. Crane was a lean man with hollow cheeks and clothes that always seemed too big for him. He traveled alone, never letting the leather pouch of money leave his side, and he had a reputation for asking few questions about what he purchased. That made him popular among plantation owners needing discreet sales. The transaction itself took under 10 minutes. Crane examined Patience with the clinical detachment of someone assessing livestock, checking her teeth, feeling the muscles in her arms, listening to her breathing. She submitted without protest, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the horizon that no one else seemed able to see. The agreed price was $2 silver, so low that even the field hands, who weren't supposed to be listening, whispered among themselves about what could possibly justify such a figure. A healthy young enslaved woman, would have brought 10 times that amount, even in the depressed market of 1857. As the money changed hands, Colonel Witmore kept his expression carefully blank, but those who knew him well noticed a slight tremor in his left hand, a tell that appeared whenever he was under particular strain. His wife, Ilalanina, watched from an upstairs window, her embroidery forgotten in her lap, her face pale as morning mist. What happened next would be told in different ways by different witnesses, but the core details remained consistent across all versions. As Crane prepared to lead his new purchase away, Patience turned toward the main house and spoke her first and only words of the entire transaction. "The Roots remember," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard despite its apparent weakness. "They drink deep, and they remember everything." The words were strange enough, but it was the way she said them that made everyone present feel as if the temperature had suddenly dropped. Her voice held no emotion, no anger, sadness, or fear. It was delivered with the same matter of fact tone one might use to comment on the weather, and somehow that made it infinitely more unsettling. Crane seemed unaffected. He simply took hold of the rope binding Patience's hands and began leading her toward the road. But as they reached the edge of the property, something happened that would fuel whispered conversations for years to come. Patience stopped walking and turned back one final time. She raised her bound hands and pointed directly at the main house. Her finger aimed at the second floor window where Ilalanina Witmore still stood watching. For a moment that seemed to stretch far longer than it should have, the two women stared at each other across the distance. Then Patience smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. Those who saw it would later struggle to explain exactly what made it so disturbing. Some said it reminded them of a skull's grin. Others claimed it looked like someone who had just heard a wonderful joke that nobody else understood. But all agreed it was the smile of someone who knew something, something that the observer very much hoped would stay hidden. After that, Crane and his purchase disappeared down the dusty road away from Magnolia Ridge, and for several hours life on the plantation returned to what passed for normal. The field hands went back to work. The house servants resumed their duties. The Witmore family gathered for their afternoon meal, as if nothing unusual had occurred. But as the sun began to set, painting the sky the color of dried blood, strange things started happening at Magnolia Ridge. It began with the dogs. The plantation kept several hunting hounds, bred for tracking runaway slaves and protecting the property from intruders. These animals were known for their fierce loyalty and unshakable nerves. But that evening they began to whine and pace, ears laid back against their skulls, tails tucked between their legs. By full dark, all 6 dogs had gathered beneath the front porch of the main house, huddled together like frightened children. When the overseer tried to call them out, they wouldn't come. When he tried to drag them, they snapped at him in desperate fear, something they had never done before. The servants, too, began acting strangely. Martha, the head cook who had worked in the Witmore kitchen for 15 years, was found standing motionless in the pantry at 10 that night, staring at the wall as if she could see through it. When questioned, she claimed she had been listening to singing, though no one else could hear anything but the usual night sounds of crickets and tree frogs. "She's singing down there," Martha insisted, pointing toward the floor. "That girl, she's singing down in the root cellar. But it ain't no song I ever heard before." The root cellar was located beneath the kitchen, accessible only through a narrow wooden door that had been nailed shut years ago. The space had once been used for food storage when the plantation was first built. But after several incidents involving spoiled provisions and strange odors, Colonel Witmore had ordered it sealed. No one had been down there in over a decade. When the overseer pried open the door and lowered a lantern into the space below, he found nothing but bare earthen walls and the musty smell of long abandoned spaces. There was certainly no one singing, but as he started to climb back up, his lantern illuminated something carved into the dirt wall near the back of the cellar. Words had been scratched into the packed earth. Letters formed by what appeared to be fingernails or some other crude implement. The writing was barely legible, but the overseer managed to make out a single phrase repeated over and over in a spiraling pattern that covered most of the back walls. The roots remember. The roots remember. The roots remember. The phrase continued in this manner, growing smaller and more frantic as it spiraled inward toward a central point where the letters became too tiny and distorted to read. But at the very center of the spiral, where all the words converged, was a single mark that made the overseer's blood run cold. A handprint pressed into the dirt, as if the clay had been soft when the mark was made. The print was small, clearly that of a woman, and around each finger were what appeared to be dark stains. Stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. The overseer reported his findings to Colonel Witmore, who examined the cellar himself the following morning. The colonel spent nearly an hour below ground with his lantern, and when he emerged, his face was grim. He ordered the cellar door not only resealed, but also piled with heavy stones against it. Then he gathered his family and several senior servants for a meeting in the parlor. What was discussed at that meeting was never fully disclosed. But the kitchen maid, who served tea during the gathering, later reported hearing Colonel Witmore say something about old debts and things that should have stayed buried. Mrs. Elenina Witmore was heard to protest that we had no choice, and that it was the only way to keep the family safe. The subject of their discussion became clearer 3 days later, when a rider arrived at Magnolia Ridge with disturbing news. Silas Crane, the slave trader who had purchased Patience, had been found dead on the road about 20 miles south of the plantation. His body was discovered by a merchant traveling the same route who noticed Crane's wagon stopped by the side of the road. According to the merchant's account, Crane appeared to have died of natural causes, possibly heart failure brought on by the heat. His body showed no signs of violence, no indication that he had been robbed or attacked. The money pouch he always carried was still securely fastened to his belt, and his wagon and horse were unharmed. But there was no sign of Patience. The sheriff who investigated the scene found the rope that had been used to bind her cut cleanly through and lying in the back of the wagon. There were no tracks leading away from the road, no indication of which direction she might have gone. It was as if she had simply vanished into the thick Mississippi air. The sheriff questioned the Witmore family, but their responses were vague and unhelpful. They claimed to know nothing about Patience beyond the basic facts of her sale, and they expressed surprise and concern about her disappearance. Colonel Witmore suggested that she had probably run off into the woods, where she would likely die of her illness within a few days. But the servants at Magnolia Ridge knew better. They had begun to notice things, small signs that something was very wrong. The first incident occurred in the cotton fields. Several field hands reported that their tools, hoes, sickles, picking sacks, were being moved during the night. They would leave their equipment in one place at the end of the workday, only to find it arranged in strange patterns the next morning. The tools were often found stuck upright in the soil, forming rough circles or spirals that reminded the workers of symbols they had seen scratched into trees in the deep woods. Then there were the sounds. The plantation had always been noisy after dark, filled with the calls of night birds, the rustle of small animals, and the distant singing sometimes drifting up from the slave quarters. But now there were new sounds, sounds that no one could identify or explain. The most disturbing was a rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from beneath the ground. It would start just after midnight and continue until dawn. A steady beat like someone knocking on the underside of the earth. The sound was loudest near the main house, particularly around the sealed root cellar. But it could be heard throughout the plantation, if one listened carefully. Some servants claimed they could hear other things as well. The sound of footsteps on wooden floors, where no one was walking. Doors opening and closing in empty rooms, and sometimes whispered conversations in a language no one recognized. Margaret Witmore, the colonel's eldest daughter, was the first member of the family to acknowledge publicly that something was amiss. She had always been prone to nervousness, but in the weeks following Patience's sale, her condition worsened dramatically. She began suffering terrible nightmares that left her screaming and thrashing in her bed, and during her waking hours, she would often be found staring out the window at the sealed cellar door. "She's still down there," Margaret told her mother one morning at breakfast. "I can see her sometimes standing by that door. She's waiting for something." Mrs. Witmore attempted to dismiss these claims as products of her daughter's overworked imagination. But privately she had begun experiencing her own disturbing encounters. She had taken to keeping her bedroom door locked at night, after waking several times to find the door standing open and the distinct impression that someone had been watching her sleep. James Witmore, the family's 19-year-old son, dealt with his growing unease by drinking more heavily than usual. He spent his evenings in local taverns, returning home well past midnight in various states of intoxication. But even alcohol could not dull his awareness that something fundamental had changed at Magnolia Ridge. One night in early November, James arrived home to find all the lights in the main house extinguished and an unusual silence hanging over the property. Even the ever-present chorus of crickets and tree frogs had fallen quiet. As he stumbled toward the front door, he became aware of a figure standing in the shadow of the old oak tree near the house. At first, he assumed it was one of the servants, perhaps someone who had been sent to wait for his return. But as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized that the figure was far too small and slight to be any of the plantation workers. It was the silhouette of a young woman standing perfectly still with her face turned toward the main house. James called out, asking who was there and what they wanted. The figure did not respond or move, growing bolder, or perhaps simply too drunk to feel proper caution. James approached the oak tree. But as he drew closer, the figure seemed to fade into the shadows, like mist dispersing in a breeze. When he reached the spot where the woman had been standing, James found nothing but undisturbed fallen leaves and the lingering scent of something sweet and cloying. The smell of flowers left too long in stagnant water. The incident might have been dismissed as a product of James's intoxicated imagination, if not for what was discovered the next morning. Carved into the bark of the oak tree, at exactly the height where the mysterious figure's head would have been, were words that made James's blood run cold. 2 coins for a life, what price for a soul? The carving appeared fresh, the wood still weeping sap where the bark had been cut away. But no one could explain how the message had been created or by whom. The letters were formed in the same crude style as the writing found in the root cellar, as if scratched into the bark with fingernails rather than carved with a proper tool. Colonel Witmore ordered the tree marked for removal, But every servant assigned the task found reasons to delay the work. They claimed their axes were too dull, the weather too wet, that they were needed for more urgent duties elsewhere. The truth was that none of them wanted to spend time near that oak tree, especially not with sharp tools in their hands. As November progressed into December, the strange incidents at Magnolia Ridge became more frequent and more disturbing. Servants reported finding their quarters rearranged in the morning, with furniture moved into positions that formed strange patterns. The plantation's vegetable garden, carefully tended throughout the growing season, began to wither and die despite mild weather. Most disturbing of all were the reports from the youngest Witmore daughter, 16-year-old Catherine. Unlike her older siblings, Catherine seemed drawn to the strange occurrences rather than frightened by them. She began taking long walks around the property, always alone, and would return from these excursions with an odd, distant expression in her eyes. When questioned about what she had seen, Catherine would give vague, unsatisfying answers, speaking of meeting a friend and having interesting conversations, but never providing details about who this friend might be or what they discussed. Mrs. Witmore grew increasingly concerned and attempted to restrict her youngest daughter's movements. But Catherine had developed an alarming talent for disappearing from the house without being noticed, only to reappear hours later as if nothing unusual had occurred. The situation reached a crisis point on a cold December evening when Catherine failed to return for dinner. The family searched the house and grounds, carrying lanterns through the gathering darkness, calling her name. They found no trace of her until nearly midnight, when Margaret heard singing coming from somewhere outside her bedroom window. The voice was high and clear, carrying a melody that none of the family recognized. The words were indistinct, but something about the tune was haunting and made everyone who heard it feel deeply uneasy. Following the sound, the searchers found Catherine standing in the middle of the cotton field, her arms raised above her head, singing to the star-filled sky. But she was not alone. Standing in a circle around Catherine were 7 figures, their faces turned upward like hers, their mouths moving in silent harmony with her song. In the lantern light, the figures appeared to be other young women, all dressed in simple white garments that seemed to glow with their own pale luminescence. When Colonel Witmore called out to his daughter, Catherine turned toward him with an expression of serene joy that was somehow more terrifying than any scream of fear would have been. She raised one hand and pointed to the figure standing directly across from her in the circle. "Father," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the field, "I'd like you to meet my friend Patience. She's been teaching me such interesting songs." The figure that Catherine had indicated stepped forward slightly, and in the flickering lantern light, the colonel found himself looking into a face he recognized with a shock of horror that nearly dropped him to his knees. It was indeed Patience, or something that wore her appearance. But there was something fundamentally wrong with the image before him. Her skin, which had been dark brown in life, now appeared grayish and waxy, like that of someone who had been dead for some time. Her eyes, once filled with pain and resignation, now glowed with an inner light that was both beautiful and utterly inhuman. And when she smiled, the same terrible smile she had worn on the day of her sale. Her teeth appeared stained dark with what might have been earth or dried blood. "Colonel Witmore," she said, her voice carrying the same emotionless tone she had used for her final words on the plantation. "How good of you to join us. Catherine and I have been having such interesting conversations about family history." The other figures in the circle began to move, turning toward the group of searchers with movements too fluid, too graceful to be entirely human. As they moved, their forms seemed to shift and blur at the edges, as if they were not quite solid, not quite there. Colonel Witmore grabbed his daughter's arm and tried to pull her away from the circle, but Catherine resisted with surprising strength. She looked at him with eyes that seemed far older than her 16 years. "She told me about the others, Father," Catherine said softly. "About all the others who came before her. Did you think we would never find out? Did you think the earth would keep your secrets forever?" The colonel's response was lost as a wind suddenly rose from nowhere, howling across the cotton field with such force that it extinguished all the lanterns and plunged the scene into complete darkness. In the confusion that followed, voices calling out, people stumbling blindly through the field, Catherine was somehow separated from the group. When the searchers managed to relight their lanterns and regain their bearings, they found themselves alone in the field. Catherine was gone, and there was no sign that the circle of figures had ever been there. The only evidence of the strange encounter was a pattern pressed into the earth where the circle had stood, a series of footprints forming a perfect ring around a central point where the soil appeared disturbed, as if something had been buried and then unearthed. Catherine was found the next morning, unconscious and apparently unharmed, lying in her own bed. She had no memory of the previous night's events, or at least claimed not to remember them. But from that day forward, she was changed. The bright, inquisitive girl who had asked uncomfortable questions became quiet and withdrawn, speaking only when directly addressed, spending long hours staring out windows at nothing visible to other eyes. The incidents at Magnolia Ridge continued throughout the winter of 1857 and into the spring of the following year. Servants reported finding strange objects buried in the garden. Scraps of cloth, strands of hair braided into complex patterns, small bones that appeared to be from animals, but arranged in ways suggesting human intelligence behind their placement. The plantation's crops began to fail despite careful attention and favorable weather. Cotton plants would grow normally until they reached a certain height, then suddenly wither and die, leaving only brown stalks that crumbled to dust when touched. The vegetable garden produced nothing but misshapen, bitter fruits that were inedible despite appearing healthy. Most disturbing of all, people began to disappear. It started with one of the field hands, a man named Samuel who had worked on the plantation for over 20 years. He simply failed to appear for work one morning, and when his quarters were searched, all his possessions remained in place. As if he had vanished from his bed during the night, no trace of him was ever found, despite extensive searches. 2 weeks later, a kitchen servant named Rose disappeared the same way. Then, a month after that, the stable boy, a young man born on the plantation, who had never been known to travel more than a few miles from his birthplace. Each disappearance followed the same pattern. The person simply vanished without warning, leaving behind all their possessions and no indication of where they might have gone or why. The sheriff investigated each case but found no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle or violence. But the remaining servants knew what the officials refused to acknowledge. They had seen the signs, heard the whispered conversations on the night wind, felt the presence moving through the plantation like a ghost seeking justice or revenge. In the spring of 1858, Colonel Witmore made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He announced that Magnolia Ridge was to be sold, that the family would relocate to his brother's plantation in South Carolina. The sale was arranged quickly, almost frantically, as if the colonel could not wait to be free of the property. The buyer was a cotton merchant from Natchez, who had never visited the plantation and seemed interested only in land value and crop potential. The sale price was significantly below market value. Another indication of the colonel's desperation to complete the transaction as quickly as possible. On the day before the family's departure, Mrs. Witmore was found in the parlor burning papers in the fireplace. When her eldest daughter, Margaret, asked what she was destroying, Mrs. Witmore replied only that, "There are some records that need not travel with us." The fire burned for hours, consuming what appeared to be ledgers, letters, and other documents that might have shed light on the plantation's history. But not all records were destroyed. Years later, when the main house was being renovated by its new owners, a collection of papers was discovered hidden behind a loose board in the colonel's study. Among these documents was a partial diary kept by Mrs. Elenina Witmore, covering the period from 1855 to 1857. The entries make for disturbing reading, though many pages are missing and others are damaged to the point of illegibility. What remains suggests that Patience was not the first slave to be sold under suspicious circumstances, nor the first to be disposed of when she became problematic in ways the diary never fully explains. One entry dated 6 months before Patience's sale reads, "Jeremiah insists we have no choice, that the alternative is too terrible to contemplate. But I fear that what we are doing is creating debts that our children will be forced to pay. The earth remembers everything, and the dead do not forgive." Another entry written just days after Patience's sale is even more revealing. She knew. Somehow she knew about the others. Her final words were not a curse, but a promise. "I see her face in my dreams now, and I fear that death will not be the end of her story." The final legible entry in the diary is dated just 1 week before the family's departure from Magnolia Ridge. The roots do indeed remember. They drink deep, and they give back what they have received. We thought we could bury the past, but the past has a way of digging itself up. God forgive us all. The Witmore family's new life in South Carolina was brief and unhappy. Within 2 years of leaving Mississippi, Colonel Witmore was dead of what was described as a sudden illness that left him wasted and hollow-eyed. Mrs. Elenina followed him to the grave 6 months later, her final words reportedly being an apology to someone not present in the room. Margaret Witmore never married and spent her remaining years in and out of private sanitariums, claiming to hear voices that no one else could detect. James drank himself to death before his 30th birthday, found one morning in a ditch outside a Charleston tavern. His last words to the doctor a rambling confession about debts that can never be repaid. Only Catherine survived into old age, but she remained forever changed. A reclusive woman who spoke little and trusted no one, spending her final years alone in a small house outside Savannah. When she died in 1891, her servants found her personal effects carefully arranged around a collection of strange objects. Braided hair, small bones, and scraps of cloth in patterns that meant nothing to those who found them. Meanwhile, Magnolia Ridge itself continued to change hands with disturbing frequency. The cotton merchant from Natchez who had purchased it from the Witmores sold it again within 2 years, claiming the land was cursed and unsuitable for farming. The next owner lasted only 18 months before abandoning the property entirely, leaving behind a half-finished letter speaking of voices in the walls and figures in the fields that vanish when approached. By 1865, Magnolia Ridge stood abandoned, its fields returning to wilderness, its buildings slowly succumbing to decay. Local people avoided the property, spreading stories of strange lights, moving through the ruins at night, and voices calling out from the old root cellar, though the entrance had long since been sealed with stones. The plantation's dark history might have been forgotten entirely if not for the work of Dr. Marcus Thornfield, a professor of Southern history at the University of Mississippi, who became interested in the property while researching his doctoral thesis on antebellum plantation economics. In 1962, Dr. Thornfield obtained permission to conduct an archaeological survey of the Magnolia Ridge ruins. What he found beneath the collapsed remains of the main house would haunt him for the rest of his life. The sealed root cellar, when finally excavated, revealed far more than old food storage areas. Hidden beneath layers of deliberately placed stones and earth, Dr. Thornfield's team uncovered a complex series of underground chambers that had never appeared on any official plantation maps or building records. The chambers contained evidence of activities suggesting Magnolia Ridge had been used for purposes far beyond cotton farming. Among the artifacts recovered were human remains, dozens of them, all showing signs of having been buried hastily and without ceremony. The bones showed evidence of malnutrition and disease, but also of something more disturbing. Deliberate modification suggesting the victims had been subjected to experimental procedures. Most disturbing of all was a chamber containing what appeared to be a primitive laboratory filled with medical instruments, chemical apparatus, and detailed records of experiments that violated every principle of human decency. The records, written in Colonel Witmore's careful script, detailed procedures performed on slaves described as subjects and specimens. The documents revealed that Magnolia Ridge had been the site of medical experiments far ahead of their time and far beyond ethical treatment. Slaves who became sick or proved troublesome were not simply sold or disposed of, but used as test subjects for procedures ranging from surgical experiments to psychological manipulation techniques. Patients, according to the records, had been scheduled for what was described as a cranial investigation, a procedure that would almost certainly have been fatal. Her sale to Silas Crane had been arranged not as a genuine transaction, but as a way of removing her from the plantation before the experiment could be carried out. The records suggest that patients had somehow learned of her intended fate and had begun speaking about it to other slaves. Dr. Thornfield's discovery sent shock waves through the academic community and beyond. The evidence was so disturbing that the university initially refused to publish his findings, fearing damage to the region's reputation and possible violence. Only after Dr. Thornfield threatened to take his research to newspapers did the university agree to a limited academic publication. But even that limited publication never saw the light of day. In 1968, just days before the planned release of his research, Dr. Thornfield was found dead in his office, apparently from a heart attack. He was only 34 years old and had no history of heart problems. His research notes and all the artifacts from Magnolia Ridge mysteriously disappeared from the university's archives, and no copies were ever found. The only trace of Dr. Thornfield's work that survived was a letter he had written to his sister shortly before his death. In it, he described experiencing disturbing dreams and the feeling of being watched whenever he worked with the Magnolia Ridge materials. The letter's final paragraph reads, "I fear that some secrets are too terrible to be revealed, and that there are forces in this world that will go to any length to protect their darkness. If something happens to me, remember that the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it is buried." Today, the site where Magnolia Ridge once stood is a state park. Its dark history carefully omitted from cheerful brochures and nature trail guides. Visitors who come to enjoy the hiking trails and scenic overlooks have no idea they are walking over ground that once soaked up so much suffering and evil. But sometimes, particularly in the early morning hours or just after sunset. Park rangers report strange incidents. Hikers claim to hear singing coming from areas where no other people are present. Campers wake to find their equipment rearranged in patterns that seem deliberate but meaningless. Metal detectors malfunction in certain areas of the park, producing readings suggesting large metallic objects buried deep underground, though excavations have found nothing. Most disturbing are the reports from visitors who claim to have encountered a young African-American woman walking the trails alone. She is described as wearing simple clothing out of place in the modern world, and she never responds when approached or spoken to. Those who have seen her report feeling overwhelming sadness and anger emanating from the figure, emotions so strong that many visitors cut their trips short and leave immediately. The woman is always seen in the same area of the park, a section corresponding to what were once the cotton fields of Magnolia Ridge. She appears to be searching for something, moving methodically through the trees, as if following some invisible map. When approached, she simply fades away, leaving behind only the lingering scent of flowers and earth. Local historians have attempted to research the identity of this apparition, but their efforts are hampered by the same mysterious loss of records that plagued Dr. Thornfield's work. Documents relating to Magnolia Ridge have a tendency to disappear from archives, and researchers who delve too deeply into the plantation's history often find their work disrupted by equipment failures, lost files, and other inexplicable setbacks. One researcher, Dr. Sarah Chen from Jackson State University, spent 3 years trying to piece together the story of patients and the other victims. She managed to trace slave records through several archives, and even located descendants of families who had worked on the plantation. But just as she was preparing to publish her findings, every copy of her research was destroyed in a fire that consumed only her office, while leaving the rest of the building untouched. Dr. Chen later reported that in the weeks leading up to the fire, she had experienced the same disturbing dreams Dr. Thornfield had described, as well as anonymous warnings to abandon her research, though she could never identify the source. After the fire, she transferred to a different university and shifted her research focus to less controversial topics. The pattern is always the same. Researchers who attempt to uncover the truth about Magnolia Ridge find their work disrupted by seemingly random misfortunes that effectively prevent them from completing their investigations. Equipment fails at crucial moments. Documents disappear or are destroyed. The researchers themselves often experience health problems or personal crises that force them to abandon their work. Some believe these disruptions are the work of organizations or individuals with a vested interest in keeping the plantation's history buried. Others suggest that the story has become so associated with tragedy and violence that it has taken on a life of its own, creating a psychological atmosphere that makes rational investigation nearly impossible. But there are those who believe something else entirely, that patients and the other victims are still present in some form, still seeking the justice denied to them in life. They point to the consistency of witness reports, the strange phenomena in the park, and the systematic way attempts to uncover the truth are thwarted as evidence that the dead of Magnolia Ridge have not yet found peace. Whether one believes in supernatural intervention or simply in the power of collective guilt and historical trauma, the story serves as a reminder that some wounds run too deep to ever fully heal. The plantation's victims were denied justice in life, their suffering dismissed as the acceptable cost of economic prosperity, their voices silenced by those who profited from their pain. In 1969, the last official attempt to investigate Magnolia Ridge came to an abrupt end when the State Historical Commission declared the site archaeologically insignificant and ordered all excavation to cease. The decision was made despite preliminary findings, suggesting the presence of significant historical artifacts, and it came just days after commission members had visited the site for what was supposed to be a routine inspection. According to witnesses, the commission members arrived on a clear autumn morning, prepared to conduct a standard archaeological assessment. But within hours of beginning their survey, several members became violently ill, suffering from symptoms doctors later described as consistent with severe food poisoning, though all had eaten different meals from different sources. The commission's leader, Dr. Robert Hayes, was found unconscious near what had once been the plantation's main house foundation. When he regained consciousness hours later, he was unable to explain what had happened. His final report on Magnolia Ridge consisted of a single paragraph recommending that the site be left undisturbed for reasons of public safety and historical sensitivity. Dr. Hayes never spoke publicly about his experience, but his private notes discovered after his death in 1985 revealed a man haunted by what he had encountered. Some places, he wrote, are too heavy with sorrow to bear examination. The earth itself rejects our intrusion, and the dead demand their privacy. We have disturbed enough. Today, nearly a century and a half after Patience spoke her final words to the Witmore family, the state park that covers Magnolia Ridge remains a popular destination for hikers and nature enthusiasts. The official park literature makes no mention of the plantation's dark history, describing only the natural beauty of the area and its value as a wildlife preserve. But for those who know where to look, signs of the past remain visible. In the section of the park corresponding to the old cotton fields, certain plants refuse to grow, leaving patches of bare earth that form patterns visible from higher elevations. Park maintenance crews report that these areas require constant attention, as vegetation planted there quickly withers and dies, despite optimal growing conditions. The old oak tree where James Witmore encountered his mysterious figure still stands, though it has never grown larger than it was in 1857. The carving that once marked its bark has healed over. But on certain nights when the moon is dark and the air is still, visitors report that the words can still be seen, glowing faintly, as if lit from within the wood itself, and sometimes on mornings when mist rises from the ground, like spirits ascending to heaven. Park rangers find fresh footprints in the soft earth around that tree. Small prints that to have been made by a young woman walking barefoot through the dew. The prints always lead toward the area where the plantation house once stood, but they never lead away. The rangers have learned not to report these findings officially. They quietly fill in the prints and remove any evidence before the park opens to visitors, understanding instinctively that some stories are too heavy for the living to bear. But among themselves they speak of feeling watched while they work, of hearing voices on the wind that speak in languages none of them recognize but all seem to understand. One ranger, a man named Thomas Mitchell, who worked at the park for over 20 years, kept an unofficial log of the strange incidents on his watch. The log contained hundreds of entries describing unexplained phenomena, equipment that moved itself during the night, animals behaving in ways that suggested intelligence beyond their natural capabilities, visitors who claimed to have encountered historical figures, providing disturbingly accurate information about events more than a century old. The thing people don't understand, Mitchell said in an interview shortly before his retirement, is that some places never forget what happened there. The earth soaks up pain the same way it soaks up rain, and when enough suffering has been absorbed, It changes the very nature of the ground itself. Magnolia Ridge is one of those places. As night falls over the state park that was once Magnolia Ridge, as the last hikers make their way back to the parking areas, and the gates are locked for another day, silence settles over the land like a blanket. But it is not the peaceful quiet of nature at rest. It is the silence of secrets held too long, of voices never allowed to speak their truth, of justice denied and never served. And in that silence, if one listens carefully, one might still hear the echo of words spoken long ago by a young woman sold for 2 coins, whose final promise has proven worth far more than any amount of money could ever be. "The roots remember," she had said. "They drink deep and they remember everything. The roots of Magnolia Ridge remember."